A storm that smelled of wet asphalt and old paper fell over the city the night his phone rang and changed everything. He was 24, thin from late nights studying law and 3 part-time jobs, the kind of young man who counted coins in jars and kept receipts in a battered wallet because every penny had a face and a story. What would you do if someone offered to erase your debts in exchange for a name and a presence? In a low-lit bistro under an amber lamp, with rain tapping a steady rhythm against the window and the bitter taste of black coffee in the air, Nathan met Margaret Caldwell and heard an offer that sounded like both salvation and a trap. Margaret was exactly what her name implied. Silver hair cut like a statue, cashmere coat that smelled faintly of lavender, eyes that measured him without pity, and an easy voice that landed like a judge. She said, "I will pay every debt. I will put your mother and you out of worry. Marry me and keep my name for as long as I need." He stared at the rim of his cup, felt the enamel chill under his fingertips, and for a heartbeat, the clinking of cutlery became a metronome marking a decision. He accepted, because survival has its own grammar, and because sometimes the future asks for what the heart is not ready to give. Stay with this story to the end, because what seemed a simple bargain became a map of secrets that tied money to memory and left a man confronting a choice between revenge and justice. Before we go on, imagine the hush of a mansion at midnight and the snap of an envelope opening like thunder. That sound would decide everything that followed. Let us go back to the night the offer was made and follow the path that led from convenience to confession to a truth that no amount of money could hide. Nathan had been raised in a narrow apartment above a bakery where the mornings smelled of yeast and the afternoons of lemon cleaner and old grief. As a child, he learned to read by the streetlights because the apartment had no electricity for a week every winter, and his mother Eleanor taught him to count change with a laugh that trembled at the edges. When his father died, the funeral had an empty seat at the head because the man had left deaths, not instructions, and Nathan grew up with a ledger in his head and the constant ache of not being enough. In university, he worked nights at a law firm, filing cabinets and retrieving coffee orders, his hands remembering the crisp texture of paper and the metallic scent of ink. He kept a small photograph of his father and would trace the fold of the collar with a thumb, as if by touch he could smooth the past into a kinder shape. That backstory held gears that connected to the offer in the bistro, his vulnerability, his oath to his mother, and a hunger to repair a past that had been messy and unpaid. When he told his friend James about the proposal, James pressed his hand to Nathan's shoulder and said, "Are you sure this is what you want?" Their dialogue stretched through a night of cigarettes and cheap beer. "I do not know," Nathan admitted. "I want to save Mom." "But at what cost?" James asked. "What will you keep of yourself?" "I will keep what I can," he said, voice small. "I cannot let her go without trying." The exchange ended with an awkward laugh and a silence that tasted like metal. In the days that followed, neighbors like Rosa from next door offered practical counsel and a loaf of bread that smelled of rosemary and lavender. The lawyer Elena Brooks reviewed documents with a careful eye, the rustle of paper and the clack of her keyboard punctuating the room. Detective Victor Hale later appeared in the margins of Nathan's life as someone who would not be invited but could be necessary. The housekeeper Agnes moved like a clock through Margaret's halls, folding linen with hands that held the musk of starch and lavender. Marco Reyes, a local journalist, would record what others omitted with the smell of ink on his fingers and the click of his recorder. And Mr. Lewis from the bank would supply numbers that smelled of varnish and possibility. These secondary figures were threads that wove into the story, each bearing a piece of the truth and a sense of the community that would watch what happened next. The marriage was arranged like a brief performance, vows spoken with clinical precision, a small ceremony in a sunroom that smelled faintly of orange blossom and old wood, camera flashes muted like distant thunder, and applause that sounded polite and distant. Before that, at the Caldwell estate, Nathan walked rooms that smelled of polished oak and citrus, feet whispering over Persian rugs and the hush of curtains. He learned the rhythms of the mansion quickly,
The clink of teacups at 4, the soft murmur of staff in the kitchen, the way the chandeliers hummed when wind moved through the cracked windows. On the 4th night, Nathan found a sealed envelope slipped under a ledger on Margaret's antique desk. The paper had a faint scent of cigarette smoke and ink, and a seal brushed with red wax that felt rough against his palm. He hesitated, hearing his heartbeat like a knocker on a door, and then opened it as if opening a mouth to speak secrets. Inside were names and dates and notations that linked Margaret to a man named Harold Keyes and to transactions that did not match charitable donations. The ledger mentioned a clinic closed abruptly years before, receipts with amounts smudged, and a line that read, "Proof attached." The room's air thrummed with the faint perfume of
bergamot and the distant sound of a radio playing a song he could not place. Suspicions swelled like a wave. Was this the price for his silence, or a map to something more sinister? He began his private investigation quietly, first with small probes. He asked Agnes innocuous questions about the staff, about early mornings and late dinners. Agnes said, "There are rooms we do not enter after dark." Her voice was a low broom sweeping facts into corners. Nathan listened for sounds at odd hours, the tap at 3 in the morning, the soft metallic breath of a safe closing, the way footsteps in a hallway could be measured in seconds and intention. He met Detective Victor Hale at a diner that smelled of grease and old coffee. "You are stepping into a life that is not yours," Victor warned. "But if you found something, you must be careful." Their conversation spun across 2 long nights, with 6 exchanges that built trust slow. "What do you need?" Nathan asked. "Proof," Victor said, "and allies." The first major tension came when Nathan discovered a locked room behind a bookcase that smelled of dust and paper and the cold breath of hidden history. He pried the latch with trembling fingers and found a small desk with a leather-bound journal, pages browned and edges crisp like autumn leaves. For a moment he only listened to the blood in his ears and the tick of an old clock on the mantel. The first paragraph of the journal read like a confession and like a ledger at once. He read and felt his throat close. This was not a simple ledger of donations. This was a record of payments labeled repair and restitution that connected names to dates and accusations, and a notation that changed the story to crime. He thought of his mother and how her laugh had once burned away the dread of unpaid bills. He thought of Margaret's polite smile. He had to decide whether to expose the secret that would demolish a reputation and rip a family apart. The tension grew as memories surfaced, and he realized that the ledger mentioned a clinic where a group of people had vanished from records, and that a man named Harold Keyes had been silenced after threatening to go public. 2 paragraphs later, he closed the book, the taste of copper in his mouth, and chose to gather allies. He called Marco Reyes and said, "I have evidence, but I need corroboration." Marco's recorder clicked on and off like a heartbeat. "Send me what you have," Marco said. "If this is real, we will need more than words." The second major tension erupted when Nathan confronted Margaret in her study with the journal on the table between them, the air thick with the scent of citrus and something floral that felt like denial. Their dialogue stretched with 9 exchanges, and no silence felt comfortable. "Why would you keep this?" Nathan asked. "Why?"
"Would you bury it?" Margaret's fingers tapped the edge of a teacup.
"You do not understand the shape of things," she said. "People made choices and paid in ways you cannot imagine." "Paid with what?" he demanded. "Not money alone," she said. "Influence, control." "You hid victims," Nathan said, voice raw. "You hid names." "Those names were necessary for stability," Margaret replied. "Stability for many." He pushed the journal forward. "Stability at the cost of lives? Sometimes the cost of change is counted in bodies," she said, and the room seemed to tilt. He flinched at the cruelty in the phrase and felt the floor drop beneath the polite veneer that had welcomed him.
The conversation forced him to choose whether to protect the woman who had saved his family or to take a path that demanded justice. The stakes were personal and public. He left that room with the taste of lemon and ash and a head full of measures that would not be neutral. He sought Elena Brooks, the lawyer, and James, the friend, to plan a safe route forward. Together they drafted a path to handle evidence with care, calling on Detective Hale and on Marco to ensure that any revelation would be backed by documents and witnesses. They confronted Mr. Lewis at the bank for transaction records and visited small clinics and spoke to nurses who remembered a van that had delivered supplies and never left. Those interviews carried the scent of antiseptic and worn chairs and the quiet murmur of people who had been on the margins of larger lives. The third major tension arrived when a courtroom crescendo took over his life. The case moved from private to public after Marco published a piece that wove the journal with bank statements and testimonies, and the city watched with the clatter of forks and the hush of shared coffee. Margaret was arrested in her drawing room, her jewelry making soft sounds like distant bells as officers read charges. In court, the air smelled of paper, coffee, and the nervous cologne of attendees. Testimonies unfolded, and the judge's gavel had a wooden voice that seemed to split the room. Nathan was called to the stand and felt the floor of his childhood apartment beneath his feet in memory as he spoke. He read from the journal and from bank statements, and the room held a silence that tasted like iron. Witnesses, including Agnes and a former nurse named Carla, recounted nights when doors had been locked and names disappeared from records. Marco sat in the gallery, gripping a recorder and a notebook, eyes like a lighthouse of proof. The prosecuting attorney laid out a chain of events that connected Margaret to cover-ups and to payments made to bury reputations and to silence threats. Margaret denied intent with a voice that was practiced and cold. "I did not intend harm," she said. "I intended protection." The question of intent became the room's heartbeat.
And the city waited like a held breath. The resolution was not immediate or simple. Margaret was convicted on charges related to obstruction and to conspiracy, and sentenced to years that would allow her to reflect in a space far from her chandeliers. Nathan felt emotions he had not named, relief braided with a new emptiness, triumph braided with sorrow for lives damaged and for his own loss. He paid the debts, the relief settling like warm bread in his chest, but he also felt the aftertaste of the bargain he had made. He established, with the remainder of the funds, and with help from donations raised through Marco's articles, a small clinic in a neighborhood that smelled of jasmine and hot tar, a place for people who needed care without paperwork that erased them. The epilogue unfolded in 3 times. 1 month later, Nathan and his mother Eleanor walked into that clinic, sunlight striking the window and the antiseptic hum replaced by voices and footsteps. The clinic offered free consultations and a ledger of its own that counted kindness and appointments rather than hush money. 3 months on, the community had gathered donations and volunteers, including Rosa and James and Elena, who had become members of a board. The clinic's waiting room smelled of coffee and crayons and the sound of small shoes on tile. And Nathan watched a father bring his child a toy and thought of the ledger that had begun this change. 6 months later, Margaret had written a letter from prison, her handwriting shaky and real, a paragraph that started with "I am sorry" and offered a ledger of regrets. He read it in the light of the clinic office, while rain tapped a steady rhythm against the windows, and the words cut in ways no money had. He wrote back, not with accusations, but with a sentence that offered a framework for repair, asking her to support restitution efforts if she meant her apology. The city turned pages with him. Journalists kept asking whether justice had been served and whether redemption was possible. Nathan had used his second chance to build something concrete, naming the clinic after his father and creating a small scholarship fund for students who could not afford law school fees. He would later, in a speech that smelled of stage lights and perfume, ask the crowd a simple question that echoed what he had asked himself many nights alone. Will justice ever erase the past completely, or is it a way to rewrite the future so people do not have to repeat the same harm? The answer was not neat. He had gained security, but lost illusions. The final paragraph of his public letter read that forgiveness was not forgetting, and that legacy was not inherited but constructed. If you were in his place, what would you have done? Would you accept the bargain for security, or refuse and risk everything for principle? Leave a comment below, starting with I.
Would accept, or I would refuse, and tell us why. Your answer may help someone facing a choice like his. If this story moved you, subscribe for more real-life accounts of hard choices and second chances, and share this video so others can think about what justice and repair can look like. In the end, Nathan kept a small thing that no one could buy, a memory of his mother laughing as the clinic door opened and a child stepped in with a scraped knee. He kept a ledger that listed not debts to hide, but names to help, and a single sentence he would say until the last page was turned. Justice is not always punishment. Sometimes it is the courage to build something better, and that is the legacy he chose.